He is on a relentless campaign to try to draw people from around the world, and particularly Europe, to Canada because we are going to have to offset some of the risks that America is creating for our economy.
A quiet shift in tone, but a major shift in direction. Canada is no longer operating on diplomatic routine. It is actively pulling global attention toward itself. Behind that effort is a deeper concern, rising uncertainty in its most important economic relationship. What looks like outreach is actually risk management, and once a country begins to reposition itself around external pressure, every diplomatic move starts carrying economic weight. The real question now is how far this adjustment goes. This is Canada Rush, where global moves are not treated as headlines, but as pressure signals inside a changing economic system. Canada is repositioning, the US is recalibrating, and the space between them is where the real story sits. The question is simple: is Canada building strength or building defense?
I do think we should be flattered as a country for the invitation because it is a reflection of how America is rewriting the rules, how the rest of the world is struggling to figure out how do we accommodate this, and the degree to which the world is looking to the speech that Prime Minister Carney gave in Davos as maybe an indication of how we do that. So I do think, we can look at it and say, well, there's a little bit of a tip of the hat there. But the reason that Mark Carney is going is not for that. He is going because he will, as Graham just mentioned, accept any invitation anywhere that puts him in rooms with European leaders so that he can strengthen our economic ties, strengthen our trade ties, strengthen investment ties.
Canada's positioning in this moment is not accidental. It is structural. Being invited into a European political framework where non-European leadership is rare is not just symbolic recognition. It reflects a shifting global alignment where traditional assumptions about leadership blocks are being tested. The backdrop to this is not celebration, but uncertainty. Across multiple regions, the global system is adjusting to a more unpredictable economic environment. Trade relationships are no longer assumed to be stable over long cycles. Instead, they are being actively reassessed in real time. That is why Canada's presence in these forums is being interpreted less as diplomacy and more as positioning. The reference to the United States rewriting the rules is not framed as confrontation, but as disruption. When a dominant economic actor changes its approach to trade and global engagement, it forces secondary economies to recalibrate their exposure. Canada sits directly inside that adjustment zone. This is where the logic of diversification begins. Engagement with Europe is not a new idea, but the intensity and urgency behind it has changed. It is no longer about expansion for opportunity, it is about expansion for balance. When one side of a trade ecosystem becomes less predictable, others become more strategically important. So what appears externally as diplomatic participation is internally a risk distribution strategy. The objective is not symbolic influence, but structural stability. And that distinction matters because it changes how every future foreign engagement is interpreted. Canada is no longer simply participating in global forums. It is actively responding to a changing economic map. And once that shift begins, the question becomes not whether it continues, but how deeply it reshapes long-term policy behavior.
And it drew criticism from some people, was we must accept the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The implication for our foreign policy is that we will no longer necessarily prioritize the idea that we will advocate on the world stage primarily for a number of human rights issues or trying to champion the causes of other countries, that instead will be driven by much more practical, pragmatic, and economic objectives. It's going to be interesting to see how the Prime Minister handles that balance. How much of the time when he's in Armenia does he speak about domestic conflicts, regional conflicts? How much does he say this is what should occur versus how much is he just there to try to secure transactional objectives? People will be watching very carefully for that.
This is the clearest articulation of Canada's evolving foreign policy mindset. The shift from value-led diplomacy toward pragmatic realism is not framed as ideological abandonment, but as adjustment to conditions. The phrase itself signals a recalibration, not what the world should be, but what it currently is. That distinction has consequences. It changes how priorities are set, how resources are allocated, and how international engagement is structured. Instead of broad moral positioning across global conflicts, the focus narrows toward outcomes that directly affect domestic economic stability. This introduces a different logic into foreign policy, one where effectiveness is measured less by alignment of values and more by measurable returns. Trade access, investment security, and economic resilience become central indicators of success. The result is not withdrawal from global engagement, but selective engagement. Attention shifts toward areas that produce direct strategic value, while other areas are approached with reduced emphasis. This creates a more disciplined, but also more constrained, diplomatic model, and it sets up a deeper question about how far pragmatic realism can go before it begins reshaping the identity of foreign policy itself.
So, in a world where China is China, India is India, and suddenly it appears as though the US has turned on us all, do we have to instead focus our attentions, our foreign policy, on self-interest? Do we have to move rather from this idea of trying to advance our broader public interest and human values, trying to project our values around the world, to trying to secure objectives, trying to secure transactional deals? And that's got to be the real politic of where we are.
This is the pressure signal driving much of the strategic recalibration. Whether interpreted literally or as perception, the idea of a shifting relationship with a key economic partner changes the entire risk calculation. Policy does not respond to sentiment alone, but sentiment influences strategic direction. When stability is no longer assumed, diversification stops being optional and becomes structural. That is where diplomatic outreach, trade expansion, and investment redirection begin to align under a single logic: reducing exposure. What matters here is not confrontation, but uncertainty. And uncertainty in economic systems always translates into adjustment. What is unfolding here is not a single policy change. It is a gradual restructuring of how Canada interacts with global uncertainty. Canada Rush tracks these shifts as they happen. The real question is, when stability becomes conditional, who adapts and who gets forced to adapt? What emerges from this entire exchange is a clear structural pattern in modern foreign policy behavior, where mid-sized economies are increasingly forced into adaptive positioning due to changes in global economic predictability. Canada, in this context, is not acting in isolation, nor is it responding to a single event or statement. Instead, it is operating inside a broader environment where traditional assumptions about trade stability, alliance predictability, and economic continuity are being continuously reassessed. The concept of a relentless campaign reflects this environment not as rhetorical exaggeration, but as a description of sustained diplomatic engagement aimed at balancing external exposure. This reflects a transition from passive participation in global systems toward active management of external dependencies. The key driver behind this shift is not ideology, but risk perception. When economic relationships that were historically considered stable begin to show variability, policy naturally adjusts toward diversification and redundancy. This creates a foreign policy model that is increasingly shaped by economic logic rather than purely diplomatic tradition. Within this framework, engagement with new regions and partners is not framed as expansion for influence alone, but as structural adjustment to maintain equilibrium. At the same time, this adjustment is accompanied by a philosophical shift in how foreign policy is justified internally. The emphasis on accepting the world as it is signals a move toward pragmatic realism, where policy is evaluated based on outcomes rather than aspirational positioning. This does not eliminate values from foreign policy, but it reorders their priority relative to economic and strategic considerations. As a result, global engagement becomes more selective, focused on areas that deliver tangible economic or strategic benefit. This introduces a form of disciplined diplomacy that prioritizes measurable outcomes such as trade stability, investment inflows, and risk mitigation. However, this also creates an inherent tension between flexibility and identity, as foreign policy becomes increasingly shaped by external pressures rather than internal projection. The perception of shifting dynamics with major economic partners contributes further to this recalibration. Even when not explicitly defined as policy rupture, perceived instability influences strategic planning, leading to diversification of economic relationships and expansion of diplomatic outreach. In this way, perception itself becomes a structural input into policy formation. Analysts observing this trend note that such behavior is not unique to one country, but reflects a broader global adjustment among economies that are positioned between major power centers. The result is an international system that is less anchored in fixed relationships and more defined by conditional engagement. In such a system, resilience becomes the primary objective, replacing influence as the dominant metric of success. The central question that arises from this transition is whether this form of pragmatic adaptation strengthens long-term strategic stability or gradually reduces the scope of meaningful global engagement to purely transactional interactions. If foreign policy becomes primarily a function of risk distribution and economic balancing, then the definition of international leadership itself begins to evolve. And within that evolution lies the unresolved tension at the heart of this analysis: whether a world built on conditional trust can sustain the depth of cooperation required for long-term stability, or whether it inevitably fragments into continuously adjusting economic blocks.